Hello, folks. Welcome back after your Japan exam. I hope you've seen the scores for the multiple choice part. I'm still working on the scores for the essay component. We'll get those back to you by Thursday. Anyway, today we're jumping right into our next country. We'll sort of do the introductory overview of it today through this recorded PowerPoint. We're going to Korea. And I've got two flags here on the first chart specifically because, well, one of the things about Korea that we need to be sure we understand is at least the Korea as we know it today is two countries. That's not always been the case. That first happened in the end of World War II. And so we have South Korea, their flag's on the left. North Korea, their flag's on the right. They actually have different names for their countries. South Korea, the casual name is Hanguk. That would be like us saying America. Their more formal name is Taehanminguk, or the people, or the Great Republic of the People of the Korean Peninsula. North Korea calls themselves Chosun. And they have a longer formal name that means the People's Republic, the People's Republic of Chosun. Hanguk, the South Korean term, comes from the Chinese character for the Korean Peninsula. That's that Chinese character on the left in the blue. And Guk is the same character that the Chinese used for Guo, its kingdom. So the kingdom of the Korean Peninsula. Chosun is an ancient name that was an ancient Chinese name for the people or the country that was on the Korean Peninsula. It literally means morning freshness or morning calm. And it was the name that Korea was known by from 1392 until it was annexed by Japan in 1910. So, they call themselves different names. They speak the same language, and they've been divided since 1945 in a practical sense, 1947 in a legal sense. The poetic name for Korea, the one that they know themselves by, is the land of the morning calm. That is, well, that's Chosun, literally. Sort of like both China and Japan's names are poetic translations of their regular, names in their language. The land of the morning calm is Cho, is morning. Sun is freshness or calmness. Freshness as in fresh in the morning. But they translate it as the land of the morning calm. Now, setting it in context, we've talked about China and we've talked about Japan. Korea is right between them. In this little map here, we have the Korean Peninsula in orange in the center. That's the whole Korean Peninsula. This is a map from the Korean perspective. The names of the little islands to the east of Japan, to the east of Korea, between Korea and Japan, closer to Korea, Ullyeongdo and Dokdo. These are relatively insignificant islands, but they're politically a big deal. The Koreans have always claimed them. The Japanese have claimed them too. So Dokdo and Ullyeongdo are the names that Koreans give them. The island to the bottom is not in dispute. That's Jeju-do. So notice the labels of the so it's off of Manchuria. Notice that there is a border with Russian Siberia as well. It's on the south. It's fairly close to Japan. That matters. The Japanese, of course, have always referred to it as a dagger or to the heart of Japan. Notice the name of the sea between Korea and Japan. Now, if you're into geography or you've paid attention the rest of the semester, that sea between Korea and Japan is generally referred to on most maps as the Sea of Japan. You don't call it the Sea of Japan in Korea. It is the East Sea. The first passage of the national anthem of Korea in South Korea. The first stanza, Donghae mulgwa 백두산이 마르고 닳도록, literally says, until the East Sea and Baekdu Mountain dry up and blow away. And the first two words, Donghae, that is literally the East Sea. So, to the Koreans, it's the East Sea. It's absolutely not the Sea of Japan. It's the East Sea, and that's a big deal to them. Lots of tension between them and Japan through lots of history. So it is, in some ways, an appendage of China. The Japanese consider it the dagger of the heart of Japan. That's sort of where it fits. It is a peninsula, so it is surrounded by water on all three sides. The Koreans like to look at the map, and they teach their kids how to recognize and remember how to draw the map. Well, by saying what it looks like. Does it look like anything in particular to you, looking at it that way? So what the Koreans say is, it's a rabbit. Note the ears at the top, the nose, the front paws, the hind legs down here at the bottom, and you even have Jeju-do down at the bottom, which you might conceivably call the droppings. Over towards Japan, you have the little bunny tail, sort of. So that's the way they see it. That's how they remember what it looks like. Of course, the ears look a little bit more like sort of antlers. I don't know, but whatever. That's it. That's the way they tend to see it. Some things, sort of context. The geography of Korea is roughly the same in terms of land mass square mileage as the state of Utah. So, you know, for an American state, it'd be kind of large-ish. In terms of landmass. You look at the map there, that is a topographical map. In the north, you can see the mountains are really very steep. It's quite mountainous. The southern part is also hilly, at least, or mountainous, but it's not nearly as much so. The population, I should update this, but the populations are very stable. Neither country is growing in population. So in 2006, South Korea had 48 million, almost 49 million. North Korea had 23 million. Okay. So South Korea is twice as populous as North Korea. A little more than. That, by the way, is a post-Korean War phenomenon. Before the Korean War, that was not true. The climate. It is a small country, so we can actually talk about the climate. It is a temperate climate, meaning they have a true 4 seasons. They actually get snow in the winter. They have a hot, humid, wet, rainy summer. It's cold in the winter. And like, most places, the spring and the fall are beautiful. For the Koreans, they'll tell you, we're the only place in the world that has a true 4 seasons. Which, of course, is hogwash, but it's their perception, and it makes a big difference to them. They dress the part. When I was there, I was there in 84 and 85 and again in 96. If you happened to decide it's warm today and wear short sleeves before the official beginning of spring, even if it was 85 degrees, everyone you ask will go, "춥잖아?" or "Aren't you cold?" "안 추워요?" "Aren't you cold?" Aren't you cold? No, it's hot. I'm not cold. And then, a day later, once spring's in, they're all going to be wearing short sleeves, even though it might be cooler, and nobody will feel cold. So it's a really big deal to them, and their seasons are nicely demarcated so that they're each roughly 3 months, divided right into quarters. That's a big deal to them. It's noteworthy that their Most of their moisture comes in the summer, which is, good for some kinds of agriculture, a challenge for others. We already talked about the nature of the geography. It is a divided nation. The way that happened in sort of shorthand, in 1910, the Korean government was largely ineffective and was kind of having problems, and ultimately, with a little push and shove from their Japanese neighbor, the Korean government largely collapses, and Japan annexes it. So it becomes a part of Japan. Now, the way they did this, they did not call it a province. A territory. They call it a province. So they're going to treat it like Alaska or Hawaii, like it's a state, not like Puerto Rico or Guam or the U.S. Virgin Islands or American Samoa, but more like Alaska and Hawaii, full statehood. At least that's the legal fiction they use. In a practical sense, they were trying to integrate it into Japan, but they were absolutely not treating the Koreans as regular equal citizens. So the Japanese occupied 1910 to 1945. The Koreans end up having to serve in the Japanese military, provide service for Japan during World War II. When World War II ends, the nation is divided. Now, it's not divided because it was enemy country, because the way the Allies, the Americans, the French, the Brits, the Russians, the Chinese, the way they defined Korea is Korea was an early victim of Japan, annexed against their will. So the plan is we will liberate Korea. But because Korea had not had its own government for at least 35 years, the plan was to occupy it and give it its independence when they're ready. Now, the Koreans found that condescending, but that's the way it turned out. Now, we'll talk more about this when we get to that part of Korean history. But ultimately, they get caught up in an emerging Cold War between the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union then. And the Russians are occupying northern Korea, the northern part, and the Americans are occupying the southern part. And so it cannot be unified. Now, this division happened because the United States used participation in occupying and rehabilitating Korea as an inducement, as a carrot, if you will, as a prize, as a reward to the Russians for their willingness to join the Pacific War against Japan. You join the Pacific War against Japan, we'll include you in the occupation and reformation of a Korean government. Okay? So it ends up with a line drawn at the 38th parallel at the beginning. The northern realm is under the Soviet influence and becomes communist. The southern realm, under the American influence, it becomes capitalist. We claim it's democratic, but it's not only actually going to become democratic until about 1988. But capitalist with some forms of democracy. Shortly after the two countries become independent or become separated and set up their own governments, we get the Korean War. The North Koreans attacked, trying to unify the country by force. The South Koreans were largely defeated until the United Nations, led by the United States, intervened to preserve South Korea's independence. Now, this is a war that in American history we look at with some ambivalence because we didn't actually win. Well, we did win, absolutely, in terms of our original mission. Where we didn't win was we didn't topple an enemy and we didn't push farther than our mission was. We didn't have an unmixed victory where America dominates and Korea is absolutely, completely tied to America. We didn't end up going there. It didn't work. So the Korean War leaves the two Koreas absolutely enemies. Families that were united together and, and had people in the North and in the South, or sometimes even if they were all on one side, end up after the war divided. It is a civil war that has, in some cases, brothers choosing opposite side. In other cases, brothers getting, or fathers and sons getting drafted into opposite sides. Since the Korean War, those families remain divided. The two countries are enemies. There is no mail, no direct mail that goes between the two. There is no trade that goes between the two. There are no visits of South Koreans to the North or North Koreans to the South, either one. There are no phone lines or no phone connections between the two countries. And these countries have a large border that, for South Korea, it's the only border they have with another country. And a long, long history of being one country. But they are two, and then are enemies at present. So the Koreans' self-identity. They see themselves as all one people, ethnically homogeneous. They emphasize that ethnic identity. It's a major part of their culture. They see themselves as a racially pure people, as unique, and their uniqueness is defined by both their language and their genetics. They are a distinctive people. They're not like the Japanese. They're not like the Koreans. They're not, like the Chinese. They're not like anyone else. They're different. So really, for a few years when I was a graduate student, I worked as an assistant in the Center for Asian Studies, Institute of East Asian Studies, they called it. And we had lots of visiting scholars from Korea, from Japan, from China that were there. And I worked mostly in the Korea section. And there was an ethnographer. This is a woman who studied ethnicity. She was a Korean American, spoke fluent Korean, had her PhD at an American university. She was actually a professor of geography. Or was it sociology? And she was a professor at UC Santa Barbara. And her research had to do with ethnicity and that sort of thing. And she was a colorful woman, a little bit, prone to flashes of anger, and to be really outspoken. She came into the office one day just angry. Oh my goodness, swearing up a storm. She was so angry. And what she was angry about is she had recently received her copy of a scholarly journal of ethnicity studies or some such thing, published by Seoul National University in South Korea. And in this journal, in this quarterly journal, there was an article published by a Korean professor. I'm not sure if the professor was in anthropology or biology or physiology, but this professor was making the case that realistically Koreans are so unique, so completely different from any other people, that they could more realistically be described as a separate species than as a race group. So quite literally, he says Koreans are a different species. They're not the same as all the other human beings. All the other human beings are one species, but Koreans are something different. Now, this ethnographer, or this woman from Santa Barbara, was so livid because she couldn't believe that the journal would publish such idiotic stuff. And she was making all sorts of crude statements about, if Koreans breed with other people, do they have children? Yes. Are those children fertile? Yes. That means we're the same species. But she was using colorful language to describe that. And so the point that I bring that up, it's not a mainstream Korean idea that they're a separate species, not at all. But the idea that they are significantly different from any other people, they're different in ways that are important to them, to their identity, to who they are, is really crucial to their culture, to their understanding of who they are. That's a big deal. They define Koreanness in explicitly ethnic racial terms. Now, what outsiders would look at, okay, they generally fit in the category of, same kinds of populations you get throughout East Asia, similar genetic characteristics in terms of pigmentation and such. They fit in the general category that is the Mongoloid category, East Asian category, whatever it may be. Now, are they different from the Japanese or the Chinese? Of course they are. You put 100 of them to get 100 randomly selected Koreans and 100 randomly selected Japanese and 100 randomly selected Chinese. I would have no trouble, even if you put them all in American clothes and didn't let any of them say a word, I would have no trouble telling you which group was the Korean group. They're going to be slightly taller, slightly heavier built on the whole. Their facial structures will be a little bit more broader, a little wider in the faces than either the Chinese or the Japanese. They'll tend to be a little heavier boned. Okay. Are there differences? Sure. Just like there are differences between Italians and Swedes. Whatever. It's not so important genetically in a biological sense that it would matter, but it matters culturally, and it matters for their own self-identity. So they have this strong sense of racial identity, self-identification that's being distinct from Japan and others. Now, I want to talk a little bit about their language. Early on, when Korea starts becoming literate, they become literate centuries before Japan does. They start leaving their own records right about the meridian of time, or 50 years later, somewhere between the year 1 and the year 50. Okay, that's pretty early. But early on, they were writing in Chinese. Okay. When do they get their own language? Well, or their own written language is much later. Now, in terms of the language, they were writing in Chinese at the beginning, but that was kind of awkward because it's not a Sinitic, or anyway, it's not a language based on Chinese. The grammar is not remotely less similar to Chinese. It's completely different. In its native vocabulary, it's completely different from Chinese. So borrowing Chinese to write it is a little awkward. So that was so they had to actually write in Chinese, not write in Korean. Now, when we get, so some things about the language, it fits in what they call the Altaic language family. It's structurally identical to Japanese. I talked about this when we were in Japan. The two languages are structurally identical. There's some cultural variations in how they're used, like how you use honorifics. But those are not language structures. Those are cultural expressions. For the Koreans, fully 60% of their vocabulary in contemporary Korean has Chinese origins, Chinese root words. And that's significant. But as a language, it's distinctive from either Japanese or Chinese. It doesn't sound like either of them to a somewhat, even a somewhat trained ear. It has a different cadence. It has a different tonal characteristic than either of them. It is a non-tonal language, meaning there are no formal tones. They do develop patterns of accents. So if you get your accent on the wrong syllable, you sound stupid. There is a little bit of that, but there's no tones. There are regional dialects, just like in the U.S. The Southerners sound funny. The Southwesterners sound especially funny. The Southeasterners, their dialect, and then they sound especially funny because nobody really speaks it outside of the Southwest. The Southeasterners sound funny, but they've had really a lot of success politically, so more people are familiar with it. So again, the early literacy was in Chinese. Early writing was always Chinese characters using Chinese grammar. In the early 1400s, the great King Sejong decided, as he put it, it is time for us to have a writing system for writing Urimal. Urimal is our words, our language. And he puts together a commission of 60 or so scholars who are experts in writing and language and pronunciation systems, and gives them a charge. They are to come up with a writing system to write our words, our language, and in his specific charge to them was it must be simple. It must be direct. It must be easy enough. It must be a language that is simple enough that women and servants can learn it. Okay, sounds like a horrible racist, right? Or sexist, I'm sorry. And he was a Confucian, so he probably was sexist in our terms. But what he's getting at, a language that we can, that women and servants can use, what he's getting at this time in Korean history, girls did not get formal academic training at all. They got basic training from their mothers. That typically meant they did not learn to read or write. They didn't have time for that. And so he's asking for a writing system that's simple enough that even people who are not going to have a formal education, women and servants, that even those people can read and write. Now, that was a practical sense so that they could write letters, so that they could communicate, so they could leave messages. But that was the program. So this group came up with a phonetic system. Phonetic is phonics, sounded out. So it's a sounded out system. Again, intended to be simple enough that servants could use it. Now here's the chart. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily look that simple. The way the chart works is you've got consonants on the vertical, running down the vertical axis, and you have vowels running across the horizontal one. The consonants, you see the rough English equivalents: ka, na, da, ra, ma, ba, sa, a, ja, cha, ka, ta, pa, ha. So you have your core consonants, 14 if I remember right. Didn't just recount, but I think it's 14. Then you have your vowels: a, ya, o, yo, o, yo, u, u, and e. Now, the basic vowels, the first one a, the third one o, the fifth one o, the seventh one u, the ninth one and the 10th one e. Those are your core vowels, 6 vowels. All the rest are just what we would call diphthongs or blended vowels, represented as a single. E-a, E-o, E-o, E-u. And there are other diphthongs as well that don't rate their own special alphabet. So you have consonants and you have vowels. Then the words are so you have specific letters So it is actually an alphabet like English or the Roman alphabet, not a syllabary like katakana or hiragana in Japan. So they're not whole syllables, they're just simple letters. So in the rest of the chart, you have the KG thing with the ka, the KG with the kya, with the ya, kya. So ka, kya, ko, kyo, ko, kyo, u, ku, kyu, k, ki. But whatever. The point, it's very orderly. It's chartable. It is really, really, really precise and really, really reliable. It's all about alphabets. Now, I used to, shortly after my mission term, I spent 2 years teaching in the Missionary Training Center, teaching new missionaries. And I would get a new group of missionaries at the end of a really, really, really intense orientation day. I would get them and have them in my class. Typically, I had 10 to 12 of them at a time in my class, and I'd meet them the first day they were in. I would meet them at 8 p.m., and I would work with them for 2 hours from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. And this is a day when they had said goodbye to their parents. They'd met their new Siamese twin that they're not going to be able to separate from for 2 months. They'd met all their new roommates. They learned all the rules. They went through all sorts of orientations, and they were exhausted between 8 and 10 that night. And my task was to come in and, speaking almost no English, just Korean and pantomiming, I would teach them to say, hello, my name is, what is your name? And give their name. What is your name? I'm glad to meet you. They'd teach them that dialogue, my name is, whatever. Then I would teach them the Korean alphabet. And by the end of 2 hours, they could greet someone, introduce themselves, express their pleasure in meeting a new person, and they could read Korean and pronounce it correctly. They wouldn't have a clue what they were saying, but they could read Korean and pronounce it correctly. And I did all that in 2 hours at the end of a really grueling, exhausting day. Okay. So if you can teach someone to read and pronounce it correctly in in 2 hours, you can see that King Sejong's goal of a writing system that's simple enough for even people who don't get a formal education, in his terms, women and servants, that they'd accomplished it. You can teach it in 2 hours, and someone knows how to. Now, this group that I would teach it between 8 and 10 at night, who could read it by the end and pronounce it correctly. Of course, they're reading slowly. By the next day, they'd forgotten most of it, and we had to start over. But it was starting over, having been familiar with it. So the way it's structured in this one, you start. Traditionally, they'd write in columns from top to bottom. Within each character, you start from the top left. Every syllable has at least 2 letters. Every syllable starts with a consonant, always, always, always. And every syllable has a vowel. Sometimes they have more than one vowel. Sometimes they have a closing consonant. Sometimes they don't. So this first one, you have the nice little the little sort of looks like a face with a hat on it. That's the hiat, the H. If you look over at the bottom of the chart, you see the H thing. Then you have the vowel right next to it, the ah. We used to teach people to remember that. That's you're sticking your tongue out and saying ah, right? You see the tongue sticking out? Ah. Okay. Then we have the next syllable down at the and then the nian at the bottom. The N sound, han. The next one we have the kiuk, the g at the beginning, the sound, and then the ril, the L sound, hangul, hangul. which means Chinese writing. I'm sorry, Korean writing. Ooh, what did I say? Korean writing. Or Korean letters. Hangul. Okay, so more on the writing system. The way the Koreans did it, they continued. In 1400, they got their own writing system, but it was meant for women and servants, so scholarly people didn't use it, and they had this idea that, well, it's just for simple stuff, notes and things. It's not something we would use for anything important. So it doesn't get really adopted. They don't develop any special literature in this language or anything. It's used to communicate within a family, to communicate for women to communicate with their friends, to leave notes for your servant, etc. When it does start to be used more completely, they still tend to try to use a mixed script, a little bit like they did in Japan. In the Korean context, the grammar structures, Chinese does not have grammar parts like Korean does. And Korean has grammar parts that are actually syllables or words. So those things have got to be written in Hangul because there's no Chinese equivalent for them. Native Korean words, they get written in Hangul because they're native Korean. They're not Chinese. But any word, any core root word that was borrowed from China, you would use the Chinese characters for that word. So in other words, to be literate enough to read something like a newspaper or any book, you would need to know Hangul, which you can do in a couple of hours and then practice. And you'd also need to know 900 Chinese characters. Well, they had 1,800 that you were required to know if you wanted to graduate from high school. 900 for middle school, another 900 for a total of 1,800 for high school. And so the newspapers would be made up of this mix of Korean and of Hangul and Chinese characters. So in order to be literate, really literate, you have to know a lot of Chinese. Not anywhere near as many Chinese characters as a Chinese person would need to know in China, but you need to know a lot of Chinese. Now, you get native language words written in Hangul, Chinese-based words written in Chinese. This was typical throughout Korea until 1945, when Korea split into, well, to be more precise, when Japan annexed Korea, they tried to suppress the use of Hangul, of the Korean script. They tried to supplant it, to replace it with the use of hiragana and katakana, the Japanese phonetic syllabary. And they expressly tried to deny Koreans the ability to learn their own alphabet. Now, Korean literature still underground was done in this mixed script. At the end of 1945, when the North Koreans and South Koreans established their new countries, they're competitive. The North Koreans conclude it takes way too much study and learning to learn all these Chinese characters. That makes literacy, in a functional sense, an elite opportunity. Only the elite can do this. And for the North Koreans, for whom equality of opportunity was a big deal, not of opportunity, but equality was a big deal, they concluded that we could have a more equal society if we simply eliminated all the Chinese. So they went to just straight Korean alphabet. And that's what all of their published literature does after 1945. That leads to complications because frequently the phonetic sounds are so similar for different words, or identical for different words that have totally different meanings. And it makes it easier to miscommunicate if you don't have the Chinese characters to back it up. Now, Americans of an earlier generation than me, of about my grandparents' generation, were expected to learn Latin if they went on to a four-year university. And the Latin, if you know a lot of Latin, that makes understanding English easier. But of course, we don't really need that. And so the North Koreans figured out they didn't really need the Chinese. So they dropped the Chinese about 1950, completely dropped it. The South Koreans continued to use it, and all of the newspapers were published in a mixed script until 1988. In 1988, the very first newspaper for adults in South Korean history came out with a Hangul-only script. Today, what the newspapers do is and most of your typical books, they write in Hangul, even in South Korea, without Chinese characters. But if you get to a word or to a personal name, most personal names are based on Chinese. If you get to a word or a personal name that is Chinese root, and if that word or the personal name is not a well-known one already, they'll include in parentheses the Chinese character, so that a person who's well-versed in Chinese would be able to understand the meaning. Anyway, it's what. So they have their own unique writing system from about 1400. When we get into the chronological history more fully, we'll talk about how that evolves and how it becomes politically and historically important. But we'll do that later. They have it from about 1400. They don't really use it a lot until after until actually the 1880s. But we'll talk about that again when we get to the 1880s. Okay, so the Koreans have their own national creation myth. It's not a world creation myth, it's a creation of the nation, sort of like the Izanagi, Izanami, and Amaterasu myth of Japan. The Korean creation myth is quite different. It is just about how the people of Korea come about. It's the Tangun story. And in this story, it's about the origins of their very first king, King Tangun, and his descent from heaven. Why he came down and how he governed for a long period of time. His arrival is supposed to have been 2333 BC. So we'll tell that story. So as the story goes, there is a god figure. There are people on the Korean Peninsula, but they're not organized. There is a god, small g, that's, again, lots of little gods, minor gods. This god's name is Hwanung. And Hwanung is kind of wandering about the mountains, and he is approached in prayer by a tiger and a bear. Both the tiger and the bear are female, and they desperately want to be human. Now, if you've read the Hans Christian Andersen original version of The Little Mermaid, where the Little Mermaid wants to be human because she has realized that human beings have immortal souls, but mermaids don't. And what she wants is the immortal soul, right? She wants to be a more meaningful, living creature with an immortal soul. And so she asks, that's what she's looking for in that story. In this story, the tiger and the bear similarly are looking for characteristics that human beings have that are above the animals, their wisdom, their spiritual characteristics, etc. And so the tiger and the bear both pray to Hwanung and beg him, make me a woman, make me a person. They're both female, so make me a woman. And Hwanung, negotiates with them a little bit, tells them it's really complicated. And they beg and they continue to request it of him, and he says, fine, but prove yourselves worthy first. And so he gives them a test, and the test is take garlic and mugwort. Okay, garlic, you guys know what garlic is, just raw garlic. Mugwort is a green, bitter herb. It's more like taking the needles off of a pine or a juniper tree. If you've ever chewed on a pine tree needle or a juniper leaf or frond, whatever you call those, or a sequoia needle or leaf thing, and they're bitter. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, something like that. Take those two things, go into the back of the cave where it's absolutely dark, there's no light, whatever, and live there for 100 days to prove that you have what it takes to be worthy of being human. So in the story, these two female animals, a tiger and a bear, go in. The bear endures for the entire 100 days. And she comes out at the end of the 100 days and begs to be a human again. The tiger doesn't have the patience, can't endure. After just a few days, the tiger flees the cave, screaming in terror, never to be seen again. At least not in this story. But the bear has turned woman. And not only is she a woman, but she is the work of Tangun. She is a beautiful woman. Okay. After a very brief period of living alone, living by herself, she realizes, here's the Taoism coming in. She realizes that life as a single human being, without a partner, without a spouse, is absolutely not balanced or complete. I am not meaningful. I do not have a major meaning until I have a husband and can have a child. So she begs for Huaneng, please give me a husband. Now, Huaneng himself is deeply impressed with his own work. She is a babe. But not only that, not only does he think she's beautiful, he's deeply impressed by her character. This is a woman who has the kind of self-discipline to endure alone in a cave with totally awful food and absolutely no light, and endure and come out with her intelligence and her mental capacity and emotional capacity all intact. She is a strong personality with tremendous self-discipline, tremendous ability to endure and suffer. And his conclusion is, you are an impressive woman, both physically and personally, spiritually, emotionally. I can't think of a better husband for you than myself. So, Huaneng marries her. They have a son together. So this is a half god, half bear turned human. Mortal, who is born and becomes, he comes with those gifts from his immortal godfather and his mortal man beast or woman beast mother. He establishes a unified kingdom over all of Korea and reigns from the top of Baekdu Mountain. That's the highest mountain peak in the Korean Peninsula, and unifies the people for what is the mythological ancient Joseon dynasty. The ancient Joseon dynasty starting in 2333 BC. There's no archaeological or paper trail historical record that Korea was unified that early or governed by a great king from the mountains that early, but it's their myth, it's their story. So that's the story. Now it says some interesting things, right? The mother personality, a bear, who demonstrates her incredible value by this super endurance test. Now, it says a lot of things about the Korean conception of womanhood. The Korean conception of the ideal woman is beautiful, yes. But more importantly, she is strong. She is powerful in an emotional, spiritual, intellectual sense. The Korean culture does not celebrate or expect intellectually, spiritually, sort of character-wise, lightweight, weak, totally submissive women. Women should be submissive. Confucianism. Okay, but they're not submissive out of weakness. Okay, I would ask the question about the importance of this myth. This will show up probably in another deal. It's important. His mother is a bear turned human. Alrighty. Now, we'll pause for a second. I want to sort of tell you a little fun story. So originally, I was in Korea as a 19-year-old. I was there from the time I was 19 and 20, serving as a Mormon missionary. And our missionaries in my faith are assigned to a place you don't get to pick. You're assigned a companion. That's your Siamese twin for at least a month at a time, often 3-4 months. And you have to stay in the same room in visual contact with that person 24/7. Personal hygiene, bathroom time is the only time you have that you're not with that person. You didn't pick that person. You typically didn't know that person before you were assigned. Now, I frequently was fortunate. I perceived it as good fortune, good blessing, that I was often assigned to have Korean companions. Now, again, I didn't choose that. I didn't get to choose that. I didn't have any say in it. But only about a quarter of the missionaries that we served with, among of the men, were Korean, and I had Korean companions more than half of the time. It was a huge blessing for me. I got to learn the language better. I learned the culture better. In some ways, it probably happened because I got along really, really well with the Koreans. Now, in an area, at one point, I got this brand new Korean companion. I was 20 by this point. He was 25. He'd already got his college degree. He'd already done his 3 years of military service. He came out on his mission. He was quite a bit older than me, but I was the senior companion because I was longer in the mission. I was training him on missionary stuff, but he was helping me with language, which was always the blessing for me to have Korean companions. And we were in a city where there were 3 congregations, and we were part of one of them, and there were 2 pairs of missionaries sharing an apartment. So there were 4 guys. 3 of us Caucasian, American, 1 Korean. The Korean was my companion. On your blue books, I put that stamp that I tell you means good luck. That stamp that means good luck is also this man's surname, his family name, Kil, which sounds a lot like Keel. And so after meeting him and realizing, oh, that is a Korean surname, I simply adopted his surname as mine while I was in Korea. But anyway, and that's why I have that stamp. Not because of the good luck feature, but because it was my personal name stamp when I was in Korea. All right, so this man was engaged. And so when we learned he had a fiance, we asked for, did you have a picture? He brought out the picture. And his fiance was was a little on the big bone side. She was round-faced. Little, sort of bigger structure, body structure. She was not petite. And being a 20-year-old and being in with just a bunch of guys, you know, I thought I would harass him a little bit. And I said, "Oh, wow, she looks like a bear." Trying to be mean. And his response was, "Yeah, she kind of does." And he was really kind of pleased with that. And I thought, I just said your woman is big and mean looking, and yeah, I mean, this is what I'm thinking, and you're flattered. What's going, you know? And so I realized later he was flattered because I had just said his fiance had characteristics like the mythological mother of the founder of the Korean nation, who was a bear, but was a really noble bear that was worthy of becoming a human and marrying a god. Now, of course, he was not primitive in his religious ideas. He didn't believe these things literally, but what I had said about this man's fiance, intending to be, you know, a rude young man teasing a friend, said I considered her to have the characteristics of an ideal woman. Right? The Korean ideal woman is strong. She is powerful. She is selfless, self-sacrificing. She's emotionally strong. So, you know, so kind of funny, but I learned something about the Korean conception of womanhood, of gender. Now, it is a Confucian culture through most of its history. It's decidedly sexist, male-dominant, as is true of Confucian cultures. But it's one where they have an expectation. The ideal woman is absolutely not a fickle, mindless, weak, emotionally or mentally frail, or even physically frail person. She is strong, and that's important. Now, we'll watch that through the history. You're going to see they celebrate a self-sacrificing power in women. Now, native religions and traditions beyond that. Traditionally, Korean religious traditions and such are animistic, the way Chinese were, meaning rocks, trees, streams, mountains, and all that thing have spirits. We conceive of them like human beings. They have the shamans. Shamanism is where you have that belief in animistic kinds of traditions, and you have a special intermediary, a person, a mystic of some sort that intervenes between us and the unseen spirit world. That person is called a shaman. Chinese have shamans. Japanese have shamans. I didn't really talk about shamans in either China or Japan because they have lots of different kinds. In Korea, there is a distinctively Korean phenomenon of a shaman that's called a mudang. The Korean mudangs are unusual in a lot of ways. They are typically, I know the book hints that you sometimes see men, but they are typically women, almost always women. I've never heard, except in this textbook, any reference to a male mudang. They're typically always women. And these women will come and do a cleansing, a seance, if you will, the driving out the evil spirits. The typical Korean mudang has an elaborate cleansing ceremony that's called the kut. It takes a half an hour or so. Starts out as a sort of chanting, rhythmic dance with noisemakers, like think tambourines and marimbas, simple noisemakers, and sometimes uses incense, not always. And then she chants and dances, and ultimately, as it winds to the end, her chant and her dance get really, 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 really fast and loud, and she's crying out and screaming and spinning and jumping and leaping, and then she ultimately collapses in a fit, in sort of an ecstatic collapse at the end, having driven out evil spirits. So the graphics here are actually lifted off of the web page advertisement of a contemporary Korean mudong in Seoul, advertising for her services. So it's something they still do. It's not super common or popular. This exorcism ceremony is called a kut. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon, distinctively Korean. And I'm going to talk about this again because the Koreans, if it's a distinctive thing that's... Now, other major things, they have a sense of a uniquely Korean emotional state. They describe it as the accumulated melancholy or pathos of the collected sufferings of our ancestors through generations. They call it Han. It's this collective burden of historic pain as a response to centuries of oppression, eons of Koreans suffering. And even when the whole nation isn't suffering, the people are suffering at the hands of oppressive leaders. When one tries to read books or read Korean literature on what is Han, when they describe it for outsiders, it always comes up to if you're not Korean, you're never going to quite understand it. And so, okay, I will acknowledge that as not being a Korean, I probably will never completely understand it. But those that are more broadly educated will sometimes say, but it is kind of like the blues, which is an emotional state that African Americans describe. Again, as a result of the cultural oppression of their ancestors and themselves, something accumulated over many generations and centuries of suffering, or perhaps of the particular sense of hardship or oppression that Jews may have felt over the centuries. So they'll talk about those sorts of things. A sense of sorrow or a sense of the blues that pervades their art. You see a lot of somber themes, a lot of sort of themes of suffering, themes of hardship in their art. When we run into, you watch the movie that comes along with Korea, you'll kind of see that theme, and you'll see in the experience of the woman who's our main character in the movie, you'll kind of understand that concept, what she's talking about a little bit. Now, so another sort of way I learned about, tried to understand Han, when I was serving there as a missionary, Mormon missionaries don't get to listen to music or read things that are not part of the approved readings while they're serving. But I was constantly riding buses, and riding the buses, they would play the radio over the bus, and they were listening to, well, popular music of the time. And I thoroughly loved the Korean, what they called pop song. Pop song. Okay, pop songs. And just fell in love with it. And so after a few months, I realized I really want to take samples of this home with me someday. But I don't know any of the artists. I don't know any of the names of the songs. So I bought myself a little notebook that I would carry with me. And when I'd hear a song that I particularly liked, I would try to use that as an icebreaker and have a conversation with usually a youngish person who was likely to know, and ask them if they knew the name of the song that we were hearing over the radio and who the artist was that performed it. And so I kept this list of all these artists and songs, and so I'll reference some of those popular songs a couple of times as we talk about Korea. But the one that's relevant here was one that was called Tacho. Tacho is literally ostrich. No, they don't have ostriches in Korea. But the song was about the struggle to find meaning and purpose in life and connections in life, and a sense of feeling disconnected, feeling useless, feeling oppressed, feeling alone. And in the melody, he would it would say, so I'm well, it says fly, 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 ostrich. Of course, you know ostriches can't fly, right? And then it would go on, you know, I'm just like the ostrich. I'm a bird who can't fly. How sad to be a bird who can't fly, right? There's nothing cool about being a bird except that you can fly. And of course, everyone wants to fly, but, you know, I'm a bird, but I can't fly. And that's Han. So my Han is that I'm like, well, apparently ostriches experience Han, right? Because they're the birds who can't fly. It also, in the same song, references the Han in Picasso's paintings. Okay, so there's a certain melancholy or horror or grief in Picasso's paintings as well. For those of you that are interested in that kind of artwork or know something about that, that might be helpful as well. Han. It pervades their culture. It's something they see as distinctively them. More things. Their native spiritual practices, their funerary practices, funerals, are very similar to the Chinese, the ones we talked about. They tend to bury above the ground, as you see here. Their conception is that the soul lingers. We're taking care of the spirit. The soul lives around. And so we need to do this, the ancestor veneration, the ancestor rites. They're similar to China in that sense. And because of that, they have ancestor tablets, they have ancestor ceremonies, they connect themselves to the ancestors, and that makes a big difference to them. Their term for ancestor veneration is Chesa. You don't need to remember that. It seems to have started up as a native concept, but gets formalized and ritualized by Confucianism, just like in China. Especially in the last dynasty, 1392 to 1910, those ancestor ceremonies were the most important political as well as civic duty of a good ruling class or elite class. Yangban is what we're going to talk about. It use the term, their term, but ruling class, a leading class person, just like in China. Okay, they borrowed also Taoism. The South Korean flag is practically a Taoist banner. White is the color of purity in Taoism. Also the color of mourning, which is kind of interesting. The symbol in the center of the South Korean flag, that's the yin-yang symbol that the Chinese use. In the Chinese case, it's black and white. It's vertical rather than horizontal, and you have an admixture of white in the black and black in the white, the little dots. The Koreans, taking the same concept and still seeing it as Taoism, they change it a little to fit themselves. It's red and blue. The red is things dominant, strong, hot, heaven, male. The blue is things submissive, weak, cold, earth, female. But they're a little more emphatically hierarchical, and even in their Taoism, right? There are the positive dominant top, the submissive negative bottom, higher and lower rather than side by side. But the same concept, Taoist. These bars on the side, you'll notice the patterns: 3 solid in the left, top left, 3 broken in the bottom right, and then the other 2 are also opposites. So again, emphasizing the Taoist concept of opposition or opposites. Each thing has its opposite. They call these trigrams. That's not the Korean word. That's the English version. These are gun, gon, I, and gam in Korean. Heaven and earth. Golly, I've forgotten the other 2. Heaven and earth, and then another set of opposites, I forget. But that's their deal. So they also do the Taoist focus on nature, the practice of feng shui, which they pronounce differently, but it's the same thing as pungsu in Korean. They adopt Confucianism, not too far behind the Chinese. They borrow Buddhism, not too far behind the Chinese. Now, looking at more modern era, Christianity arrives later in Korea than it does in China or Japan. You don't see any Christianity at all until the 1780s, when Catholics show up. That sort of gets a mixed bag reception. Then in the 1880s, Protestants show up, and for absolutely historical geopolitical reasons, Protestantism is brilliantly successful in Korea, and once Protestantism takes off, then Catholicism makes a resurgence as well, and it is heavily influenced from the 1880s by Christianity in really important ways, which we'll get to the bottom. There we go. The gun gon I gam, heaven, earth, sun and moon. But anyway, the trigrams. So, Taoism, again, further Taoism. They've got the feng shui thing, which they call pungsu, geomancy. We've talked about that in the Chinese context. The Japanese do some of it too. The Koreans have this wonderful folk tale, which I think I already told you about in China. Maybe I didn't. I'll repeat it. About the 5 frog brothers. So feng shui pungsu does all the same things in Korea as China. Interior decorating, architecture, city planning, all that stuff. And then they have this wonderful story about, to emphasize feng shui and, of course, Confucian patterns of filial piety, of 5 frog brothers who are all, well, kind of troublemakers and disobedient and not very submissive to their mother, to their parents, the mother in particular. And it's probably a play on words, because the word for a troublemaker in Korea is gagojangi, and the word for a frog is gaguri. They're probably, there's a word play going on there. But the 5 frogs are troublemakers. And ultimately, they reach adulthood. They're disobedient. They're not respectful to their mother. And their mother dies. And they realize belatedly that they should have been respecting her. And they're deeply sorrowful, deep remorse that they have not honored their mother as they should, and they turn over a new leaf, and they're going to do it all right. So they go to great lengths to pick a particularly beautiful spot for her burial, and they bury her in a beautiful spot near the stream, in a green, lush place that she loved. And they believe they have done what they need to. They're going to remember her in ancestor ceremonies and make sure that in her afterlife, she is revered and all is well. And then the spring rains come. The stream rises, floods the newly dug or newly implemented grave, washes the grave away, because these are not dug down, they're above the ground kind of, and washes away the grave and the remains of their deceased mother. Which means they don't have her gravesite and her body to remember, to carry out the ancestor ceremonies and celebrate it, and they are completely foiled. Why? Well, because as young frogs, they had been so disobedient, they had not learned the things they needed to know, even when they tried to turn over a new leaf as adults. They had missed basic knowledge and couldn't make good. Any well-educated frog or child would know one consults a feng shui specialist to pick an appropriate burial site. And certainly a feng shui specialist would know better than to place a grave very near a stream that floods in the spring. So it emphasizes, filial loyalty out of Confucianism, and this feng shui thing from Taoism. They all of those sorts of things. Now, Confucianism shows up in Korea seriously right about the same time as Buddhism, about the year 1. It is something borrowed from China. It becomes the dominant governing ideology. All of the governments from about 50 AD forward use Confucianism in some form, to some degree. When we get into later dynasties, especially the last one, Chosun, from 1392 forward, Confucianism is the official governing ideology. It has a huge impact on their culture. You'll remember the 5 relationships which give us hierarchy. People know their place. Confucianism is ritualistic and formal. You have that in the Korean thing. Confucianism is absolutely male dominant. You have that in the Korean culture. So Confucianism is a major part of their tradition. Buddhism comes in about the same time, about 50 AD or so. It is Mahayana Buddhism coming through China. It becomes super important and the dominant religious tradition about 500 CE or AD. Early dynasties from the especially from the Shilla about 600 AD, but even earlier ones are officially Buddhist. It becomes politically, it's politically dominant. Yes, your governing system is Confucian, but Buddhism is a really powerful institution in all the early dynasties. The last dynasty, the Chosun dynasty, tries really hard to push it out and persecute it. So from 1392 to 1910, we have significant persecution of Buddhism, but it in really important ways. So Catholics show up in Korea first in 1774. Protestants show up 110 years later in 1884 in a big way. They both become politically and socially very important in Korea, beginning in the mid-1880s or late 1880s. We'll talk about that when we get to that part of Korean history. It's something that I care a lot about. It's a major part of my dissertation work, so you'll hear a lot about it. Protestants especially have been really politically important from the 1900 forward. Catholics made a resurgence in 1970. Okay, so just following up, Korea is influenced by which of the following, or all but one of the following: Buddhism, Catholicism, Confucianism, Taoism, and Shinto. And of course, all of them are really important in Korea over extended periods of time, except Shinto. Now, Shinto is imposed on them briefly from 1910 to 1935 when the Japanese are there. But as soon as they're able to get rid of the Japanese, they're done with Shinto too. All right, that's as far as I want to go today in our sort of video proxy lecture, if you will. There will be an assignment on Canvas for you to kind of do sort of in place of the clicker questions. Check up on what you're doing. Show me you were putting in the effort. And so please go do those. Do that. I will see you on Thursday. Please look at the schedule in Canvas and be sure you're up to date with the reading schedule. I will try to adapt that a little bit because we're a lecture behind. But I will see you Thursday. All the best.